education that we thought we could afford to buy. It was small enough for the money we had to invest. It was a wonderful business town because Springs had 2 big mills here, which meant there was a big payroll, and Springs had built lots of homes here for their workers, so they didn't pay much rent. So whatever they made could be used on clothing and other things they wanted to buy. Bank of Fort Mill was very helpful in our success. You can't imagine the way the banks operated then and how strict they are today with different things that they were not strict with there. Like, if somebody wanted to write us a check at the store and we didn't know them, all we had to do was pick up the phone in the office and call the bank. And they would tell us whether it was a good check or not a good check. And sometimes they would say, if you run over right now with it, it'll be good. I mean, they would tell us things like that. Can you imagine a bank doing that? They were just cooperative.
Well, I was born in 1941, and of course World War II started in 1941 in December. During the war, though, we did have blackouts, and we had local wardens that would patrol the streets, and they would check houses for signs of any light. And if they saw something coming through a blind or shade, then they would come to the door and make you aware of it and get you to do whatever you need to do to cover that up. And it was all done in a very friendly, warm sort of way. Back during the war, there was rationing. You couldn't get meats, you couldn't get butter. That's when margarine kind of came into being. Still sugar, flour, gasoline, rubber, you couldn't get tires. It was an effort that everybody contributed to. There was nobody that was left out of the war effort during World War II.
I was 13 at the time, and when they announced that the war was over, everyone went to Main Street. The church bells were ringing, everybody was dancing around. We just had the best time. It was the end of the war, and the boys were coming home.
It's hard when you have a different religion in a town that doesn't have a synagogue. It was difficult for us because Saturday, we observed Saturday as the Sabbath. My husband would go sometimes on Saturday morning to services and come back in the afternoon. Bernie, my youngest son, he would go to Charlotte every Saturday to the synagogue on that train. People would look after children. The train conductor would always greet him, he said, and he waited. He was checking on it to be sure he got back. They looked after the children, they really did. Now we've got 2 synagogues in town.
Hugo was, to me, it's still unbelievable, the damage. You know, you see it on TV where signs and things are going down the street, and that's the way it was here. I got out sometime over the night. It was down in the police department where you couldn't hear a whole lot. And sometime over the night, I got out and signs and things were blowing down the street, and that's when I knew that we were in a lot of trouble here. We had only rescued, I think it was one lady, her house crushed in. After it was over, the volunteers, there was a group coming here from Georgia that helped us, didn't cost us a dime, and just the volunteers that worked on the situation. It was just great.
My husband, Bud, was a pilot for Celanese, and he flew really mostly in the United States, Canada, and some overseas. But one time he flew Lady Bird Johnson down to Charlotte. And he said, now, Betty, I'm flying Lady Bird and don't tell anybody. He didn't like any variety. Didn't want anybody focusing on him. So anyway, the next week, Fort Mill Times came out, and there was Bud with his co-pilot and Lady Bird Johnson. Bud Thomas flies Lady Bird to Charlotte. And he was furious. And I said, well, Bud, I just told my mother.
I went to a segregated school in Fort Mill, South Carolina, and the school's name was George Fish School. That experience was, it was understood that you just didn't have certain things. It seemed like to me it was just as we made good with what we had, and we were happy to have had what we had, and we were people who were taught to work for what we got, and that's how we made it. But I remember segregation. We had the white-only signs here, and that was at the water fountains as well as bathrooms. I remember all this, and I remember the not being able to go in the front door at the theater. If you didn't want me, I didn't want to be there. At least that's how I felt at the time. And then our parents, of course, they would find ways to keep us satisfied with bringing whatever we needed home, so we didn't have to worry about trying to go places to be served. But somehow or another, I just knew that it wouldn't be like that always.
At school, I loved social studies, and we had studied the Revolutionary War. And one of the boys says, Miss Thomas, when's your birthday? And I said, well, don't you remember? I read you that poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, on April the 18th. And he looked at me and he said, are you that old? He was not one of my brightest students.
When I was first elected mayor, I had served on council for 6 years. I was first elected mayor, and I went to the office every day. I was out doing something. But anyway, I went in one afternoon, and the lady said, Mr. Mayor, said, a lady called here this morning, said she was just bad upset. Said she wanted me to tell you to come by her house. Her commode was leaking. And I said, okay. Said, you just wouldn't believe it. I said, where does she live? She told me. Said, I told her you didn't work on that. Said, look here, girl, you must be new. You don't tell me what Charlie does. Tell him to get his hiney by here and work on my commode. Her float was hung. That's what it was. And I said, oh yeah, I know exactly where you're talking about. I'll go by there this afternoon. And she said, that new girl up there don't know nothing, Charlie.
I was licensed at 14 years old, and I knew I was a pretty good driver. And when I went to take the license test, I passed it with no problem. And I just decided, you know, that would be a way to make money to pay for whatever expenses I had at graduation. So that kind of pushed me to get the job as a bus driver.
I was mayor 24 years. My first time running for mayor in '84, I ran on planned orderly growth. And now I realize I didn't have any idea what I was talking about.
Well, you know, I tell people, and we kind of get aggravated with the traffic, and you know, that's just kind of a natural thing, I think. But then when you stop and think about it, you know, do you want to live where somebody else doesn't want to live? And when I think about it that way, I thought, you know, maybe things not as bad as we really think. And anytime, you know, progress comes with a price. And I think if we go back to, probably the original economic activity in Fort Mill was the old grist mill, from where we get our name. And I'm sure that when that happened, there was somebody up the street said, I'm glad we're going to get a mill nearby so we can get our corn ground. And then I'm sure somebody else said, well, that's just gonna ruin the neighborhood, you know. And that's probably been going on ever since then. The good Lord's got a way of doing things, and I couldn't think of anything but it. It was a great way to raise a family.